Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is part 2. This video is sponsored by Mohammed. Apologize, I'm trying to get some things set up. I had to feed all my animals, and then I'm making myself some French toast. It just sounded good with my pumpkin spice coffee and my green cup. I swear it is. It's not green. It's a blue green. That's why it's not completely disappeared. Oh, it's so good. 'Tis the season for, cinnamon and pumpkin spice. Okay. So this is Slavery in Islam. This is Dr. Jonathan Brown. Dr. Yasser's over here. See that? Click that thumbs up button for me. That helps out tremendously. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to. You also can sponsor a video by donating to the channel through the thanks button. Request a video. Your name gets sponsored on a video. You can still request without it. You just don't get that extra shout out. Okay? Let's get into part 2.
So there's nobody who's going to be okay to follow. There's no one who's going to be free of the taint of slavery from world history, essentially, before the 1600s. So we have a problem. We have two axioms. Slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil throughout space and time. All slavery is slavery. That force us to condemn everything in our past, essentially. Whether you're Americans or Muslims or Hindu or Buddhist. That's a really big problem. So we have in our minds a knot that something that actually cannot hold together. It can't hold together. And the second you start picking at that or talking about that, the pieces start to fall apart. People don't like to talk about it. Why does this conundrum exist? Why does this conundrum exist? It's actually a result. It's also a result and a product of abolitionist discourse. So abolitionist discourse in the United States and Britain from the late 1700s into the mid 1800s argued that all slavery was a gross and intrinsic evil that had to be gotten rid of immediately. Why did it make this argument? If you're an abolitionist and you're willing to talk about some kinds of slavery being good and some kind of slavery being bad, what is the slave owner you're arguing going to say? Oh, look, yeah, I agree with you. Slavery is evil. I mean, when it's done badly, but my slaves, come look at them. They're so happy. Look how good I take care of them, right? Or, yes, we know slavery in maybe the Caribbean is bad or in the Americas are bad, but slavery in India, this is very different, right? This is not severe. So the second you start allowing distinctions within this concept of slavery, you lose you're essentially unable to force your opponents into accepting your position. It opens the door of negotiation. So ultimately the abolitionist position became all slavery in and of itself, by fact of it being slavery per se, cannot be accepted. It's all intrinsically evil. The problem is, if you're a historian who wants to look at slavery in world history, what are you going to notice? You're going to notice that slavery, let's say in India, is really different from slavery in the Americas, or that slavery in Istanbul is really different from slavery in Southeast Asia. And so you're going to start actually talking about these distinctions that will start to pull the threads out of this abolitionist argument. So that's why this discussion it's not easy for us to have it, because it starts to pick at the very abolitionist consensus that is held worldwide today.
In America, I think some of it stems from and I want to use another point after this, but in America, I think a lot of it stems from a lot of the people in the South and some in the North, but mostly people in the South are automatically labeled as slave owners, when not every person in the South, even those who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, came from slave owners. Owned slaves. And I think a lot of the issues comes from when you tell someone you're in the South, hence you were a part of slave owners, so you're bad. Some people are like, yeah, my family fought for the Confederacy, but they didn't own slaves. And you're like, it's like you're condemning them for something that they didn't do, but they took part in the war on that side. Other people, their family legitimately were slave owners. And so when you condemn them, it's an attack on them personally, but it's not. But it is. It's an attack on them personally for something that they had nothing to do with. And that's not fair to them. And so they don't want to have that discussion, that argument, because it's instantly going to turn into them being the problem. We are 160 years removed from the Civil War. 160, I'm going to say. And it's, in terms of history, that is like a very short window of time. Now, I don't know exactly how it's done in Germany, but Germany teaches about the history of Adolf Hitler. Now, he's not slavery, but just go with me here. We can all agree Hitler, not a shining star of what you want your children to grow up to be. With that said, Germany handles it by just full force, right on. This is where we were wrong. And this is where we are wrong. And instead in America, this is why they're wrong. We're right. And that's another issue where, unfortunately, even the people in the Union that fought to hold the country together and may have been against slavery, those soldiers who fought probably didn't enlist knowing they were going to fight to free slaves, because they probably wouldn't have signed up. Not all of them. But we have to stop. The South is guilty because of this. We're innocent. We as a people, collectively, we are guilty. And I think if you handle it differently and you approach that talk to where I'm telling you right off the bat, I'm wrong, I did bad, this is my fault, we're all in this together, then I think you can start to have that discussion without saying, look, I'm not going to say who's to blame, but you know who you are, Ted. You know what I mean? Like, everyone's going to be like, oh, okay, we're starting right off the bat like that. So I think the discussion needs to be more of a we're guilty, and stop trying to, and stop trying to distance myself from it. I had nothing to do with it, but I'm an American, and it was an American issue.
Okay. The abolitionist movement, as I said, that developed in the United States and Great Britain in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, defined slavery legally. It defined it through a legal definition. What does that mean? It talked about a certain kind of relationship or institution that it called slavery. It didn't talk about conditions. So it looked at the legal definition of relationship, not at conditions. Why would it not look at conditions? Why would it look at a legal definition, in this case the idea that someone is owned by another person? Why would it do that and not look at conditions? Because if you're an abolitionist, let's say, arguing with a Southern slave owner in the United States, and you start saying slavery is about someone being in bad conditions, work conditions, or living conditions, that Southern slave owner is just going to say, oh yeah? Look at your factory workers. They look actually more miserable than my slaves. So they didn't want to have, you don't want to have that discussion. You want to open that door. So slavery is defined as a legal relationship. So what are the problem is that this, one of the premises of the slavery conundrum, right, is that slavery is a gross and intrinsic evil across space and time. It's not about slavery's evil in our society. It's not about slavery's evil in the modern West or in Western Europe or in the Americas. It's slavery's evil throughout history, backwards and forwards in time, across the world, wherever you are. So the problem is coming up with a definition for slavery that works in all those times and places is basically impossible. It's basically impossible. You end up with definitions that are so abstract, that they're ultimately result in us projecting our own assumptions and understandings onto the past. What do I mean by that? Let's just look at three ways that have been used to define slavery. First, slavery is lack of freedom. Slavery is when someone is not free. Okay, here's the problem. We could say, let's say in the United States, we could define freedom. We could maybe even define freedom in the West. But how do you define freedom throughout human history? What is it to be free? In Roman law and in Western legal tradition, free means you can do whatever you want except what the law prohibits, right? Okay, but what's being a slave? Slave is you can do whatever you want except what your master prohibits. So freedom and slavery are not, freedom is not a complete lack of restraint or constraint. Freedom is just less constraint than a slave has. And exactly what constraints a free person has on them and exactly what constraints a slave has on them differ from time to time and place to place. And if you were to sit around and say, or you're going to make an argument that, well, a slave is always denied basic rights. What basic rights? Actually, you can't find a consistent notion of what the basic rights that slaves or non-slaves should have in human history. You could say, well, at the very least, let's say a slave can't, a slave maybe you can just go and kill, and you can't do that to a free person. But that's actually not true. Most slave systems in world history, you could not just kill a slave, even their owner. And by the way, under Roman law, until the 2nd century AD, in theory, a father could kill his own child with no legal consequences. It's called patria potestas. So in Roman law, a father or the head of a family, the male head of a family, could kill anyone in his own family with no legal consequences in theory. It didn't really happen, but in theory.
So he could kill anyone in his family, but he couldn't kill a slave? Okay.
So even the notion that, the idea, a slave is someone you can just do anything to and have no consequences, that doesn't help you in Roman law because that also describes a father of a free person or the status of a free child. You could say, well, let's define slavery as property, somebody being the property of another person. How do you define property? In the Western legal tradition, we can define property, usually it's like a bundle of rights, the right to use, the right to exclude, the right to sell, the right to destroy. But sometimes you have some of those rights and you own something. For example, you can't do whatever you want with your house and you own your house. You can't do whatever you want with your pets and you own your pets. You can't sit there and torture your pet, right? It's against the law. But if you have let's say a Van Gogh painting and you just feel like being a jerk, you can destroy that Van Gogh painting. It's just yours. So property, what it means for owning different things is different, even in one society. Then try and come up with a definition for property across world history. You end up with something like this. Property is a person having some kind of rights over something. And then so slavery would be one person having some kind of rights over another person, which basically describes almost any relationship. Sometimes we talk about defining slavery as coercion, coercive power over somebody. Same problem. How do you define coercion? We could come up with a clear understanding in the United States about what was unacceptable coercion in a relationship. But then to say we can project this definition across world history, Almost nobody in world history would be free if they lived up to like modern American labor standards for what is a coercive relationship. I just, on the airplane here, I watched part of Wonder Woman. It's research. Look, it's going into my talk. Okay. So there's this scene where Wonder Woman is World War I. Do you guys see the movie? No, okay, they didn't watch Wonder Woman. So basically, she comes to England in World War I, and she's from some island that's stuck in ancient Greece history. And so she meets this woman who's a secretary of the guy. And she says, "What's a secretary?" And the woman says, "Well, whatever he says to do, I do, and wherever he says to go, I go." And Wonder Woman says, "Where I come from, we call that slavery." Right? So there's this kind of notion there that the idea is the filmmakers are saying that modern laborers or treatment of women in the workforce is kind of like slavery. This, as you can imagine from the example I just gave you, this gets very political. This gets very political, even in let's just say the modern United States, let alone globally. So one example of this is in the 1790s in England and Scotland. There were these people working in Scotland in coal mines. And there was actually a debate about whether or not these people were slaves or not. In fact, they would sometimes wear collars with their master's name on them. These were white, like Scottish people. And the main argument for them not being slaves wasn't about how they were treated or whether or not they were born into slavery or not.
Was it because of their skin color?
It was the fact that people had decided there was no slavery in England.
Oh.
After the 1770s, there was no slavery in England. So it was like it was basically a political statement about the nature of British society that defined whether these people were slaves or not how they were treated even. Another great example of this is this notion of modern day slavery, which I'm sure you read about in the newspaper or in magazines, hear about on the news. So in 1957, there's a major convention called 1926, there's a major convention for the outlawing of slavery globally. And in 1957, there's a supplementary convention. So the 1926 convention is about outlawing slavery. 1957 convention is about outlawing things that are like slavery but not slavery. And one of those is what's called bonded labor. Bonded labor means I agree to work for you for a certain amount of time, and in return, you pay for my trip to Dallas, Texas, and you pay for my housing, and I work for you for 10 years, and then after that, maybe I can stay here, but we're done. So that's sometimes it's called indentured service or bonded labor, right? So in the 1957 convention, bonded labor is not slavery. It is servitude that is similar to slavery, but not slavery. According to what's called the new slavery or modern day slavery as it's been understood from the late 1990s until today, the major portion, one of the largest, if not the largest portion of global slavery today is bonded labor. So what you see is actually, it's like an inflation in the concept of slavery. What was not slavery in 1957 has become slavery today. Another example of this is prison labor. So in the late 1990s, some advocates for prisoners' rights in the United States started saying that prisoners in the United States are essentially slaves, because the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution does not allow forced labor and slavery except for people who are in prison. Those people can be forced to work for essentially no pay. People didn't really accept this argument. But now, what do you see? Even scholars of new slavery and people who are major advocates of what's called new abolitionism. In 2006, they did not accept that prisoners in American prisons were slaves. Now those same people are saying, we're reconsidering it. What changed? Did the conditions of American prisoners change? No. Did the definition of slavery change? No. It's just political circumstances changed. Things like Black Lives Matter, movies like, documentaries like 13th. And now, again, yes or sorry, but this is research. Thor Ragnarok, who saw Thor Ragnarok? Okay, I shouldn't ask these questions at this mosque, okay? None of you saw Thor Ragnarok, nor should you. I did it for research purposes.
Thor Ragnarok was hilarious.
In Thor Ragnarok, there's this alien master of this planet who runs like this gladiatorial competition played by Jeff Goldblum. And he's sort of this very schmarmy politician, kind of corporate politician. And there's these gladiators are rebelling. And his minister comes up and says, "Sir, the slaves are revolting." And he says, no, don't say that. Don't say that word. And they said, "What, revolting?" He says, no, the S word. Don't say the S word. And then the person says, "Sorry, the prisoners with jobs are revolting." So then when you get Hollywood behind the idea that American prisoners are actually slave laborers, you can see how much this has changed since the late 1990s, when saying American prisoners were slaves would just sort of fall on deaf ears and maybe even be considered unpatriotic. Okay, so you have this notion of, even in the last couple of decades, an inflation, like a devaluing of the moral power, or the power of the word slave. Another example, by the way, is, I know this is in Texas, the idea that the white people who came to America were slaves because they were indentured servants. Isn't this taught in the Texas school curriculum? Someone told me this. Okay, I don't know about this, but someone told me this. I'll have to reevaluate this. But it was so there's this. You see the idea that, like, my ancestors, some of them came to the U.S., to then the North American British colonies, as indentured servants. And so the argument of some kind of white nationalists is that, well, yeah, we had slavery in America, slavery of black people, but white people were also slaves because they were indentured servants. And to which a lot of African Americans would say, what the hell are you talking about? Those people chose to come, whereas my ancestor was just grabbed and sold.
They also, the indentured servants, as he said before, you worked for a period of time. Some, like, he wasn't an indentured servant. I don't remember the term for it. But, why is the name just gone now? Benedict Arnold, right? Hated in America now. Benedict Arnold was, I got a burp, hold on. So I thought I muted it. You're welcome. Benedict Arnold, I almost said Benedict Cumberbatch, not the same person, Kris. Benedict Arnold was sold to a lawyer, and like he worked for this guy. I'm trying to remember, I'm sure I'm incorrect thinking right off the bat, but this guy taught him like the law and stuff like that. And then when his time was up, when he hit a certain age, like maybe 7 to 10 years, when his time was up, he was given some money, some clothes, and said, "There you go, see you later." And he was set free. A little bit different. Plus, the person wasn't really like put on an auction block, stripped nude. Benedict Arnold, that didn't happen to him. He didn't have to show his teeth, and what a tremendous specimen he is. You didn't have to go through any of that humiliation. So, not the same at all.
Right. But here's the problem. By the modern definitions of new slavery, those white people were slaves. So when you start talking about projecting some of these definitions backwards in time, it starts to mess with how we conceptualize slavery in history, what we're willing to accept as slavery versus what we're not willing to accept. Okay. We end up with situations where we come up with definitions for slavery, but that definition ends up including something in history that we don't really think is slavery, versus other things that look a lot like slavery to us, but don't fit our definition. So we end up with definitions that don't really work. We're not able to put everything we want into the definition and exclude the things we don't want. So up here on the screen, you have two figures. On the right would be Melik Ambar. Melik Ambar died in 1626. He's an Ethiopian slave general who was brought to the Deccan city of Ahmednagar and was a senior general there, and then eventually became like the power behind the throne and the regent in that city. On the left-hand side, you have Sokulu Mehmed Pasha. He's sitting there presiding over a bunch of heads. Yes, those are heads of enemy soldiers. He was the Grand Vizier, he died in 1579, the Grand Vizier of 3 Ottoman sultans. 3 Ottoman sultans. His family made him a slave when he was 18 years old. He was from a Serbian Christian family, and they made him they gave him to the Sultan as a slave when he was 18 years old, so that he could become a powerful member of the Ottoman administration, because the senior administration of the Ottoman Empire at this time and for another century after that were all slaves. He was the most powerful, except for the Sultan, the most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire for decades. The richest and most powerful. He was married to one of the Sultan's daughters, actually. And yet he was technically a slave. So are we really going to say that Sokulu Mehmed Pasha is an example of the same phenomenon as a field hand being lashed in the summer heat of South Carolina in the year 1750? Are we really going to say this is the same phenomenon? And if we say we can't make internal distinctions because all slavery is slavery, what is that? That really handicaps us morally. I mean, we end up making the same moral judgment for these two different situations that are so dramatically disparate from one another. And just so you know, this isn't just what you think you're going to get in trouble for saying at a barbecue. This is even true amongst academics. There's one of the leading scholars of slavery in American history. I was listening to a speech she gave, and she was talking about the conditions between slaves in the field versus slaves in urban areas in the American South. And someone asked her, so how do the conditions differ? And she was about to say something, and she stopped herself. And she said, I was about to say one is better than the other. But she says, basically, this is not appropriate. We don't like to talk about one thing being better than the other because they don't want to introduce the concept of saying one kind of slavery is better than the other, because axiom number 2 is all slavery is slavery. You can't make internal distinctions. Okay, so this leads us to 2 major handicaps.
I was just going to say, well, I'm going to stop it here. Went a little too far, but that's okay. I was just about to say, are they different? Yes. Are they still bad? Yes. It's like comparing a war wound. These 2 people were injured in war. This person got shot in the shoulder. Gonna live, just doesn't have full range of motion in his left arm. This person, IED went off, blew off his leg, blew off half of his arm, shrapnel in his face, and lost an eye, and he's, potentially blind in the other eye, ear blown off. In that scenario, who would you rather be? I'll take ow over the other. But both are still bad. You know what I mean? Both are still sustained in war. So, I understand it's not as, my example is not quite on equal footing, but you understand what I'm saying. So I'm going to end this here. This is part 2. The next video will probably be a little minute short-ish or so. Probably be about the 56 minute mark. I don't remember. Anyways, I'm going to end this here. Be back for part 3. Until then, have a good day. Have a good night.